The Battle of Savo Island, also known as the First Battle of Savo Island and, in Japanese sources, as the First Battle of the Solomon Sea, and colloquially among Allied Guadalcanal veterans as the Battle of the Five Sitting Ducks, was a naval battle of the Pacific Campaign of World War II, between the Imperial Japanese Navy and Allied naval forces. The battle took place on August 8–9, 1942 and was the first major naval engagement of the Guadalcanal campaign, and the first of several naval battles in the straits later named Ironbottom Sound, near the island of Guadalcanal. The Imperial Japanese Navy, in response to Allied amphibious landings in the eastern Solomon Islands, mobilized a task force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer under the command of Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. The task forces sailed from Japanese bases in New Britain and New Ireland down New Georgia Sound, with the intention of interrupting the Allied landings by attacking the supporting amphibious fleet and its screening force. The Allied screen consisted of 8 cruisers and 15 destroyers under British Rear Admiral Victor Crutchley VC, but only 5 cruisers and 7 destroyers were involved in the battle. In a night action, Mikawa thoroughly surprised and routed the Allied force, sinking 1 Australian and 3 American cruisers, while suffering only light damage in return. The battle has often been cited as the worst defeat in the history of the United States Navy. After the initial engagement, Mikawa, fearing Allied carrier strikes against his fleet upon daybreak, decided to withdraw under cover of night rather than attempt to locate and destroy the Allied invasion transports. The Japanese attacks prompted the remaining Allied warships and the amphibious force to withdraw earlier than planned, temporarily ceding control of the seas around Guadalcanal to the Japanese. This early withdrawal of the fleet left the Allied ground forces, which had landed on Guadalcanal and nearby islands only 2 days before, in a precarious situation, with limited supplies, equipment, and food to hold their beachhead. Mikawa's decision to withdraw under cover of night rather than attempt to destroy the Allied invasion transports was primarily founded on the high risk of Allied carrier strikes against his fleet upon daybreak. In reality, the Allied carrier fleet, similarly fearing Japanese attack, had already withdrawn beyond operational range. This missed opportunity to cripple the supply of Allied forces on Guadalcanal contributed to Japan's inability to later recapture the island. At this early critical stage of the campaign, it allowed the Allied forces to entrench and fortify themselves in sufficient strength to successfully defend the area around Henderson Field until additional Allied reinforcements arrived later in the year. The battle was the first of 5 costly, large-scale sea and air-sea actions fought in support of the ground battles on Guadalcanal itself, as the Japanese sought to counter the American offensive in the Pacific. These sea battles took place every few days, with increasing delays on each side to regroup and refit, until the November 30, 1942, Battle of Tassafaronga, after which the Japanese, eschewing the costly losses, attempted resupplying by submarine and barges. The final naval battle, the Battle of Rennell Island, took place months later on January 29–30, 1943, by which time the Japanese were preparing to withdraw and evacuate their remaining land forces. Background: operations at Guadalcanal on August 7, 1942, Allied forces landed on Guadalcanal, Tulagi, and Florida Island in the eastern Solomon Islands. The landings were meant to deny their use to the Japanese as bases, especially the nearly completed airfield at Henderson Field that was being constructed on Guadalcanal. If Japanese air and sea forces were allowed to establish forward operating bases in the eastern Solomons, they would be in a position to threaten the supply shipping routes between the US and Australia. The Allies also wanted to use the islands as launching points for a campaign to recapture the Solomons. isolate or capture the major Japanese base at Rabaul, and support the Allied New Guinea campaign, which was then building strength under General Douglas MacArthur. The landings initiated the 6-month-long Guadalcanal campaign. The overall commander of Allied naval forces in the Guadalcanal and Tulungi operation was U.S. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. He also commanded the carrier task groups, providing air cover. U.S. Rear Admiral Richmond K. Turner commanded the amphibious fleet that delivered the 16,000 Allied troops to Guadalcanal and Tulungi. Also under Turner was British Admiral Victor Crutchley's screening force of 8 cruisers, 15 destroyers, and 5 minesweepers. This force was to protect Turner's ships and provide gunfire support for the landings. Crutchley commanded his force of mostly American ships from his flagship, the Australian heavy cruiser HMAS Australia. The Allied landings took the Japanese by surprise. The Allies secured Tulungi, nearby islets Gavutu and Tanambogo, and the airfield under construction on Guadalcanal by nightfall on August 8. On August 7 and August 8, Japanese aircraft based at Rabaul attacked the Allied amphibious forces several times, setting afire the U.S. transport ship George F. Elliott and heavily damaging the destroyer US Jarvis. In these air attacks, the Japanese lost 36 aircraft while the U.S. lost 19 aircraft, including 14 carrier fighter aircraft. Concerned over the losses to his carrier fighter aircraft's strength, anxious about the threat to his carriers from further Japanese air attacks, and worried about his ship's fuel levels, Fletcher announced that he would be withdrawing his carrier task forces on the evening of August 8. Some historians contend that Fletcher's fuel situation was not at all critical, but that Fletcher used it to justify his withdrawal from the battle area. Fletcher's biographer notes that Fletcher concluded that the landing was a success and that no important targets for close air support were at hand. Being concerned over the loss of 21 of his carrier fighters, he assessed that his carriers were threatened by torpedo bomber strikes, and, wanting to refuel before Japanese naval forces arrived, withdrew as he had previously forewarned Turner and Vandergrift. Turner, however, believed that Fletcher understood that he was to provide air cover until all the transports were unloaded on August 9. Even though the unloading was going slower than planned, Turner decided that without carrier air cover he would have to withdraw his ships from Guadalcanal. He planned to unload as much as possible during the night and depart the next day. Japanese response: unprepared for the Allied operation at Guadalcanal. The initial Japanese response included airstrikes and an attempted reinforcement. Mikawa, commander of the newly formed Japanese 8th Fleet headquartered at Rabaul, loaded 590 naval troops on 2 transports and sent them towards Guadalcanal on August 7. However, when the Japanese learned that Allied forces at Guadalcanal were stronger than originally reported, the transports were recalled. Mikawa also assembled all the available warships in the area to attack the Allied forces at Guadalcanal. At Rabaul were the heavy cruiser Chokai, the light cruisers Tenryu and Yubara, and the destroyer Unagi. En route from Kavieng were 4 heavy cruisers of Cruiser Division 6 under Rear Admiral Aritomo Gochu, Aoba, Furitaka, Kako, and Kinugasa. The Japanese Navy had trained extensively in night fighting tactics before the war, a fact of which the Allies were unaware. Mikawa hoped to engage the Allied naval forces off Guadalcanal and Tulungi on the night of August 8 and August 9, when he could employ his night battle expertise while avoiding attacks from Allied aircraft which could not operate effectively at night. Mikawa's warships rendezvoused at sea near Cape Street, George in the evening of August 7 and then headed east-southeast.